So they've fled conditions that might involve war, persecution, and they're coming to environments that, notwithstanding the best efforts of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the agency supporting the High Commissioner, are very difficult. And they're particularly difficult for families and for children, but also, frankly, for the men who are displaced and they don't have places to work. They often have been involved in violence and have a lot of pressures or attractions to stay involved in military activity. So it's pretty striking if you look at that system, how difficult it seems to be to change, because many of the things that don't work well about that system have come about for reasons that are very logical, like the host countries don't want to integrate refugees into urban settlements. They don't want a huge refugee population becoming involved in local politics. They're concerned about the practical consequences, about the economic cost. So often refugees end up in these very marginal regions in camps that are not very pleasant places to live. What most surprised me today is that despite all those difficulties, the people in the room, which included a mix of people who have experience with refugee issues and people who are thinking about design but are not necessarily experiencing the substance of this issue, they came up with remarkably interesting ideas to push this discussion forward and to help us improve the lives of refugees. So just to give you two examples, without for a moment completely leaving aside the really big picture questions about governance, about the law, about policy and politics, about resources, questions came up like, can we do something about the fact that refugee camps are laid out as an endless series of grids in some places, where if you look at them from the air, you sense some rhyme or reason, but if you're one person standing in essentially an instant city of tents of 185,000 people that goes up within a span of days or weeks, you have no idea what's where. You have no idea how to get around. There are no signposts or no landmarks. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that refugees often have to queue up and wait for hours to get a ration of food, despite the fact that they actually have cell phones? And maybe there are things we can do to figure out a way to use even the very basic cell phone technology they have to avoid these interminable queues that are not good for anybody. But what also surprised me is that people had a mix of serious recognition of how difficult the problem was, but also some desire to think bigger, to ask questions like, well, what happens to the refugee camps even if the refugees all leave? Is there a way to make these places an important resource for the surrounding community? Or even in the more naturally occurring frequent situations where refugees stay for a very, very long time, in fact, for decades in these camps, can we think of the camps as a resource for the community? Can we think of them as a meeting place or an opportunity to improve the lives of the populations that are there that otherwise might not be very happy to suddenly receive a big influx of refugees? So how can you think of this as a resource and an opportunity for the community receiving the refugees, and not just for the refugees themselves?
You know, why is CISAC and Stanford in particular, why are we involved in this? This is an issue that people have been working on for decades. Why did UNHCR come to Stanford and to you and CISAC in particular?
This is a problem that takes a lot of careful thinking about practical constraints and politics and technical challenges, but it's also a problem that benefits from research and careful analytical thinking. And what's interesting about Stanford is that over the past few decades, it's developed a number of institutions within the university that are all about straddling this very tense divide between practical and deeply theoretical and analytical and academic. I think the design school is one example. CISAC is another example. CISAC has been around for 25 years, and the goal of CISAC is twofold. It's to bring the world of international security and cooperation to the university for the benefit of everybody here, for our students, for our faculty, for fellows, but also to bring the resources of the university to the world, to think about what Stanford can do to contribute to arms control, to efforts against nuclear proliferation, efforts at peace building, to deal with situations where there's a post-conflict problem, and people like Paul Weiss, our CISAC-affiliated medical school professor, goes in and asks, how do you rebuild a healthcare system? And in that respect, I would say the challenge of helping UNHCR improve the condition of refugees is unique in some ways. It's about a population of forced migrants. It's about a UN institution that has strengths and weaknesses, but it's also not entirely unique. It's partly a continuing example of the efforts that Stanford can make through CISAC and through the design school and other of its components to connect the world of the university to the rest of the world.